In August of 2025, a woman named Brenda Langford opened her power bill and could not understand what she was looking at. The number was $780. She keeps her house at 78 degrees, she does not run her air conditioning cold, and when a reporter asked her about it, she did not give a speech. She asked a question: how can I pay this? She has one customer in one summer, and a hot Georgia August will do that to a bill on its own. So this is not the story of her $780. It is the story of why a question like hers was hanging in the air all across Georgia in 2025. Because the average Georgia Power residential bill had just risen by more than $43 a month in 3 years, across 6 separate increases. And in the middle of that, the people who set those rates approved the largest expansion of electricity generation in the modern history of the state, 9,885 megawatts. More than double the output of all 4 reactors at Plant Vogtle, the most expensive power plant ever built in the United States. 5 new plants worth of machinery, and roughly 80% of it is being built to run something most of the people paying for it will never set foot inside: a data center. This is the story of how Georgia decided to build a second power company on top of the one it already had, who asked for it, and who is going to pay for it. And it is the story of a promise made to everyone with a meter that was carefully written to sound like relief. Start with the thing everyone agrees on. The demand is real, and it is enormous. A data center is a building full of computers, and the artificial intelligence boom needs them by the hundreds. They do not sleep, they do not idle, and they draw power at a scale that has no real precedent in the ordinary economy. A single large campus can ask a utility for as much electricity as a small city. Georgia, with cheap land, tax incentives, and a business-friendly regulator, became one of the places they wanted to be. By 2025, Georgia Power was telling its regulator that it was facing load growth it had never planned for. In its own long-range filing, the company projected around 8,500 megawatts of new demand over 6 years. That was roughly 2,600 megawatts more than it had forecast just 2 years earlier. Almost all of the new growth traced back to large users, and the largest of those users were data centers. So the company came to the 5 elected officials who hold the power to say yes, the Georgia Public Service Commission, and it asked for permission to build. On the 15th of July, 2025, the commission approved Georgia Power's resource plan. 5 months later, on the 19th of December, it approved the generation to go with it. The vote was 5-0. Here is what those votes bought: 9,885 megawatts of new capacity. Georgia Power's own capital cost to build its share of it is at least $16 billion. Around 60% of the new generation is natural gas. 5 new gas-burning units at 3 existing sites: Plant Bowen north of Atlanta, Plant Wansley to the southwest, Plant McIntosh near the coast. The rest of the plan leans on renewables and battery storage, up to 4,000 megawatts of solar and around 1,500 megawatts of batteries. It is by any measure an engineering achievement. It is also, by the Commission's own staff estimate, a machine whose full lifetime cost, once you count the outside power contracts and the wires needed to connect it all, could run to somewhere between $50 and $60 billion. Those two numbers, the 16 billion and the 50 to 60 billion, are not the same number, and it matters that they are not. The 16 billion is what Georgia Power will spend building its own plants. The 50 to 60 billion is a broader estimate, made by the Commission staff and by consumer advocates, of what the whole arrangement could cost over the decades it will run. One is a construction budget, the other is the size of the thing casting the shadow. Keep both in mind, because for the rest of this story, the argument is about who stands under that shadow. To understand why a promise like this one lands the way it does in Georgia, you have to know that this is not the first time the company has built something enormous and sent the bill down the same wires. About 2 hours east of Atlanta, near the town of Waynesboro, sit 2 nuclear reactors called Vogtle Unit 3 and Unit 4. When the state approved them in 2009, they were going to be the first nuclear reactors built from the ground up in the United States in a generation, and they were going to cost about $14 billion. They did not cost $14 billion. They came in about 7 years late, and by the time they were finished, the total price across all their owners had climbed past $35 billion, more than double the estimate, the most expensive power plant ever built in the country. Now, the reactors work. Unit 3 came online in 2023, Unit 4 in 2024, and today they produce enormous amounts of electricity with no carbon coming out of a stack. That is real, and it counts. But how they were paid for is the part that matters here, because it is the same machine sending the bill down the same wires. A state law passed in 2009 let Georgia Power do something unusual. It let the company charge its customers for the reactors while they were still being built, not after they switched on and started making power, during. For years, Georgians paid a line on their bill for 2 reactors that produced nothing at all because they did not exist yet. By the time the second one finally came online, the average residential customer had paid close to $1,000 toward them for power that, for most of that time, was not there. And when the overruns had to be settled, the question of who would eat the difference went back to the same 5 commissioners. In December of 2023, they decided. Of the billions in cost above the plan, they let Georgia Power charge its customers for the great majority of it. The company's investors absorbed a share. The customers absorbed more. This is the backdrop the freeze arrives against. When Georgians look at their power bill and ask why it has climbed so steeply, the honest answer names 2 things above all others: the price of natural gas after 2022, and Vogtle. Nobody has published a clean figure for exactly how many of those dollars are the reactors and how many are the gas, and this film will not invent one. But the 2 are, by every account, the biggest reasons the bill went up by more than $43 a month across those 6 increases in 3 years. So when the same company comes back, a year after switching on the most expensive plant in American history, and asks to build the largest generation expansion in the state's modern history, and promises that this time the arrangement protects the ordinary customer, it is asking to be trusted by people who are still paying for the last time. That is not proof the new plan is bad. It is the reason the new plan gets read closely. And it is why the promise attached to it deserves to be read closely too. It is easy, in a story about billions and megawatts, to forget that a megawatt has to be made somewhere, by burning something in a real place with a name. The gas in this plan gets burned at 3 of them. Plant Bowen in Bartow County, north of Atlanta, already one of the largest fossil fuel plants in the country. Plant Wansley to the southwest. And Plant McIntosh in Effingham County near the coast, not far from the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge. 5 new gas-burning units spread across those sites, built to run for decades. By one analysis, if those units ran at full output, they would add millions of tons of carbon dioxide to Georgia's air every year. That figure is an estimate of the ceiling, not a measurement, and it should be held as one. But the direction is not in dispute. A plan sold in the language of clean, cheap, abundant power for the future is, in its largest part, a decision to burn more gas. And the people who live near those sites, and the people who simply pay the bills, noticed. The backlash was unusual in its scale. An organizer with the Sierra Club in Georgia described it plainly. "We have never seen anything like this level of citizen pushback," he said. "As soon as one of these proposals comes up, there are thousands of people on a Stop the Data Center group online." This was not, in other words, a quiet regulatory matter that slipped past a sleeping public. People saw it coming. Now the promise. Just before all of this, in the summer of 2025, Georgia Power and the Commission announced something that sounded like a gift: a rate freeze. On the 31st of July, the Commission finalized an agreement to freeze the company's base rates for 3 years, through at least 2028. After 6 increases in 3 years, the increases would stop. Read that sentence carefully, because the important word in it is the small one: base rates. Your power bill is not one number, it is a stack of them. The base rate covers the company's plants, its poles and wires, its profit. But sitting on top of the base rate are other charges, and the largest of those is the fuel cost. The money the company spends to actually burn gas and coal to make the electricity. The freeze does not touch that. Fuel costs are reviewed on their own schedule, and they can rise whether or not base rates are frozen. And there was a second carve-out. In the autumn of 2024, Hurricane Helene had torn across Georgia, and the cost of repairing the grid after it, hundreds of millions of dollars, was set aside to be collected later, in a separate proceeding in 2026. The freeze did not cover that either, so the freeze is real. It is also narrower than the word suggests. It holds one part of the bill still, while leaving the 2 parts most likely to move, the fuel and the storm, free to keep moving. A freeze on the thermostat is not the same as a freeze on the weather. Then came the part that made headlines. As part of the December agreement, Georgia Power committed to something specific. It said it would structure its next rate case, the one due in 2028, to put at least $8.50 a month of what it called downward pressure on the typical residential bill, around $100 a year. Some coverage reported it simply as a coming rate cut. It is not a rate cut. Listen to how it is actually built. It is not money back. It is not a lower bill next month. It is a commitment to design a future rate proposal, 3 years from now, in a way that pushes in the direction of lower bills. Any actual change would land between 2029 and 2031. And all of it depends on one thing being true: that the data centers show up and pay what the company projects they will pay. You do not have to take a critic's word for how soft that is. Take the Commission's. When a staff member named Rob Trokey was asked about it, on the record, he did not spin it. "There is no guarantee," he said, "that bills will go down. That is the promise. A directional nudge 3 to 6 years away, contingent on a forecast, written and reported in language that sounds like relief arriving in the mail." Now, in fairness, Georgia Power has an answer to all of this, and it is not a foolish one. It deserves to be heard in full. The company's position is that the data centers pay their own way. Under rules the Commission approved, large new users have to sign longer contracts, commit to minimum bills, put down financial security, and pay up front for the infrastructure they require. In the company's words, large energy users pay the full cost to serve them. Residential customers, it says plainly, are not subsidizing data center growth. The data centers get dedicated infrastructure, so they do not lean on the poles and wires that feed your house. And the company argues that this is not just neutral for ordinary customers. It argues it is good for them. The chief executive, Kim Green, put it this way: "Large energy users are paying more," she said, "so families and small businesses can pay less." Georgia Power estimates that arrangement is worth around $102 a year to a typical residential customer by 2028. The commission's chairman, Jason Shaw, called the rate freeze nothing but good news for ratepayers. If the forecast holds, that case is a strong one. A giant new customer arrives, signs a contract to cover its own costs, and helps carry the fixed costs of the whole system. Everyone's bill is a little lighter than it would have been. That is the deal as its architects describe it. The entire question, the one the rest of this story turns on, is that first word, if. Here is what makes this story different from a simple fight between a utility and its critics. The most serious warning about this plan did not come from the critics. It came from inside the commission. The commission's own public interest advocacy staff looked at Georgia Power's numbers, and they did not fully believe them. By their assessment, only about a third of the enormous new capacity was backed by data center contracts that were actually signed. The rest rested on projected demand. Deals expected, but not yet done. And the staff spelled out what happens if the projection is wrong. If the plants get built and the data centers do not all arrive, the cost of that unneeded machinery does not vanish. It rolls onto the people who are left. The staff estimated that if demand fell short, residential bills could rise by $20 a month or more. They put a figure on the waist, too, as much as $3 billion a year by 2030 for capacity the state did not end up needing. Georgia Power pushes back on this directly and with its own hard number. Its director of resource planning testified that the company was holding 7,900 megawatts of signed data center contracts. Not hopes. Signed. To the company, that is the answer to anyone who calls the demand speculative. So you have two numbers from two sets of serious people. The company points to 7,900 megawatts already under contract. The commission's own staff says only about a third of the total build is truly covered and warns of a $3 billion a year mistake if the rest does not materialize. Both of those things were said in the same building, about the same plan. There was one more voice, and it is worth being careful about exactly what it is. A group of scientists and legal advocates working with the Southern Environmental Law Center commissioned an independent analysis of the demand projections across the whole Southeast. The modeling firm ran the utilities forecasts through a simulation thousands of times over to see how often reality would land where the company said it would. Their finding was stark. Georgia Power's demand projection, they reported, came true in roughly 1 out of every 500 runs. About 0.2%. In their model, the likely growth was a fraction of what the utility was planning to build for. Now the honest caveat, that study was commissioned by a group that opposed this plan. It is a real analysis with a described method, but it is not a neutral referee, and it should not be treated as one. The company would tell you it is advocacy dressed as arithmetic and points again to its 7,900 megawatts of signatures. Set them side by side and do not pretend the gap resolves cleanly. On one side, a company with signed contracts and a business reason to build. On the other, its own regulator staff and an outside model, both saying the forecast may be far too large. The plan was approved as if the first side were simply correct. That is the decision. Whether it was the right one is the thing that will take years and bills to find out. The vote itself came in December of 2025, and the room was not quiet. For more than 2 hours before the commission voted, ordinary Georgians stood up and spoke about their bills. It went on so long and grew so heated that at one point protesters chanted that the power belonged to the people, not to Georgia Power, and were escorted out by police. Then the 5 commissioners voted. 5-0. Yes, but something had already happened that the vote could not undo. A month earlier, in November of 2025, 2 of the sitting commissioners had stood for election, and both had lost. They lost races that had turned, more than anything, on the rising cost of power. Their replacements, elected on that anger, would take their seats on the 1st of January 2026, just days after the vote. One of the departing commissioners, asked about it, said he felt for the customers paying more, but had no regrets about how he had voted. So the people had, in a sense, already answered, not in the hearing room, where they were escorted out, but at the ballot box, where they could not be. They had voted out the officials who set their rates, and it changed nothing about the plan because the plan was approved by that same commission in the narrow window before the new members arrived. So, was it worth it? Ask the plain question the way this channel always does, and admit that, for now, it cannot be answered. That is the honest position. If the data centers arrive as promised and pay as promised, Georgia will have built the power for a new industry without breaking its households, and the people who approved it will have been right. If the demand falls short, Georgians will spend decades paying off gas plants built for customers who never came, and the warnings from the Commission's own staff will have been the true forecast. What can be said is that the story did not end with the vote. By the spring of 2026, Georgia Power and the Commission were already fighting again, this time over a disputed fuel cost deal, the very part of the bill the freeze had never covered. The friction the critics predicted had already started to show. And 2 more seats on the Commission, the body that will oversee every dollar of this for the next decade, come up for election in November of 2026. This is the strange arithmetic of the power bill. The machine is enormous and mostly invisible. The gas plants will rise in 3 counties most of the state will never drive through. The data centers will hum behind fences, and the cost, whatever it finally turns out to be, will arrive the way it always does. Quietly, monthly, in a stack of small numbers on a piece of paper, in a house kept at 78 degrees, next to a question that a lot of people in Georgia are still asking. How can I pay this?